All right, so I'm hoping this week, it would have been nice to have finished it just before Pesach, but we'll do it right after Pesach, but to finish Yevamot. We had 6 months Yevamot, and then start next week, we'll start the Agadata of Avodah Zarah. So from what I saw from the Yaakov, the Agadata with all of the commentaries is roughly the same length between Yevamot and Avodah Zarah, and I feel like the content is different enough that it could be interesting to look at that also for the second half of the year. But here we'll finish off. The final parak of Yevamot is a really important one. It talks all about the Dinei Agunot. So all these halachot about where you can be mekel when it comes to freeing a woman where you're in doubt as to the status of her husband. Right? Perhaps more famously, and we'll be touching on this, one of the most famous examples is, right, if a husband goes off on a sea voyage, and you hear reports that the ship sunk, and the husband, no one knows where he is. So at what point can you declare him dead and allow his wife to go marry somebody else? So there's lots of halachot and different opinions on what you can do. So we'll be looking at we'll be looking at an Agadata, a story that has to do with halachot in that regard, but then perhaps have a message embedded inside of that story, and we'll look at a couple of mafarshim that talk about what that's really saying. So the specific halacha that's at play here is this halacha of if a man goes off on a sea voyage, and you don't know what happens to him. So there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim in regards to 2 different types of water. So there's what's called mayim she'en lahem sof v'mayim sheyesh lahem sof. So the way the commentaries understand yesh lahem sof is that you can kind of see the border, right? It's a lake, it's enclosed. Then mayim sheyesh lahem sof is where you have that enclosure, and then mayim she'en lahem sof would be more an ocean or a sea where it can go on in theory for a long, long time. And the idea there is that you may want to draw a differentiation between the two in the sense that if there's a mayim yesh lahem sof, so if a person survived, you would have expected to have heard about it because it's small enough that word would reach that this person survived. But mayim she'en lahem sof, who knows if the person survived, where they washed up, where they ended up. You have to be a little bit more cautious in declaring whether a person is alive or not. So there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that mayim sheyesh lahem sof isha muteret. So if you have mayim sheyesh lahem sof and the husband disappears, so the wife, and it's however long a certain period of time elapses and nobody hears about him, so the wife is permitted. You can assume that he died. But mayim she'en lahem sof isha asura, because he could in theory have survived, since the water of body was large enough and you just didn't hear about it, so you are not allowed, the woman is not allowed to marry, and she remains in aguna until the situation is clarified somehow. So that's the opinion of the Chachamim. And then a couple of stories are brought in support of the Chachamim's opinion. So we'll be learning one now. So Yevamot and Daf Kuf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph teaches as follows. It says, Tanya, it's taught. Amar Rabbi Gamliel, Pa'am achat hayiti mehalech basfina. One time I was on a boat, Rabbi Gamliel says, V'ra'iti sfina achat shenishbera, and I saw from the boat another boat that had capsized. V'ra'iti mitztaer al talmid chacham sheba, umanu Rabbi Akiva. And I was distressed over the fact that I knew Rabbi Akiva was on that other boat, and I saw the boat had sunk. So that was a source of distress for Rabbi Gamliel. Ukshaliti beyabasha, ba v'yashav v'dan lefanai ba'alacha. But then I finished my sea voyage, I went back to the yeshiva, and then Rabbi Akiva is sitting there teaching halachot. So Amarti lo b'ni, mi elcha. So I said to him, how did you survive the shipwreck? So Amar li, daf shel sfina nizdamen li, v'chol gal v'gal sheba alai na'nati lo roshi. So Rabbi Akiva said that there was a board from the shipwreck, from the boat that was floating in the ocean, and I grabbed onto it. And I made my way towards shore, and each wave that came and threatened to drown me, na'nati lo roshi, I lowered my head. So I lowered my head as the waves were coming, and I eventually made my way to shore, and that's how I survived. Just as a small aside, so this idea of daf shel sfina, there's the Daf Yomi program, like the founder of it, I think Rabbi Shapiro was his name. So he used to use this, I believe, as kind of this, as a vort, right? This idea that you have kind of the gal v'gal, that each wave that comes, you kind of hold on to the daf, and then if you do it the whole way, you can eventually survive the voyage. You make it all the way through Daf Yomi. He kind of had a more homiletical teaching from this. But daf here is...
Meir Shapiro.
Meir Shapiro, yeah, thank you. But daf here literally means a board, like a plank. So we'll see in a minute what it means that Rabbi Akiva lowered his head. The Gemara has a small tangent. Mikan amru chachamim. So here there was this maxim, or wisdom. Im yavou rasha'im al adam yna'nea lo rosho. So if wicked people come towards come at a person, so he should lower his head, just as Rabbi Akiva had lowered his head when the waves were coming. Okay. Then back to Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel concludes. So after he hears from Rabbi Akiva how he survived, Rabbi Gamliel says, "Amarti be'ota she'a kama gdolim divrei chachamim." How great are the words of the chachamim? She'amru mayim sheyesh lahem sof muteret, mayim she'en lahem sof asura. Right, as we said, that waters that don't have an end, the woman is forbidden to remarry because perhaps the husband had survived. Rabbi Gamliel, when he heard how Rabbi Akiva survived this shipwreck out in this, mayim she'en lahem sof, and he thought he had died, and then he saw him sitting and teaching halacha. So Rabbi Gamliel saw this as a support or as a proof to the Chachamim's opinion that you need to be machmir in a case where the waters are endless, because a person could, in theory, survive and you wouldn't have known about it. So that's what the Gemara says. So let's look at a second and try to understand what does it mean Ne'aneti lo roshi, and that im yavou rasha'im al adam yna'nea lo rosho. So Rashi, which I didn't bring here on the source sheet, but Rashi basically says it means that Rabbi Akiva lowered his head when he had these waves that were threatening to crash. So instead of trying to fight the waves, he lowered his head and went under the water. So he was hanging onto this plank of water, and then each wave that came, so he was slowly swimming towards the shore. The wave came, he lowered his head, and it crashed over him, and he continued on his way. And that was how he managed to survive. And so the Eitz Yosef understands from that what the teaching of Chachamim is in regards to wicked people. So the Eitz Yosef teaches as follows. He says, Mikan amru Chachamim v'chulei. So lemod miderech hachipus v'nisayon hativ'i. So this is something that the Chachamim can learn just from inquiry and from just the knowledge of nature, just experience in how nature works. What does that mean? כמו שאין טוב לאדם להילחם נגד גלי הים ששוטפים בכוח ויתנהל לאט עד יעבור זעם, פן אם יעמוד כנגדם בחוזק הם יתחזקו כנגדו יותר ויתעלף באמצע ולא יכול להינצל עוד. So the Eitz Yosef says we all know when it comes to strong waves that the best thing to do, rather than try to, if you're caught in an undertow and you're being pulled into the current, so instead of trying to fight the undertow, you're supposed to let it carry you to a point where you no longer have to fight it anymore, and then you can, right? In other words, that if someone's drowning at sea, the practical advice is instead of flailing and wearing out all of your energy trying to fight the waves, instead you should let it drag you out and then more slowly try to make your way to shore once you're past that particular undercurrent. So that's what the Eitz Yosef is noting here, that if you want to survive, instead of fighting the waves, you should let the waves, as it were, you should lower your head, let the waves crash over you and get carried out of it to sea, but then be able to make your way to shore afterwards. Because if you try to fight the waves, then they will come at you with strength and you may end up fainting and drowning. That's what the Eitz Yosef says. So just like that is the situation which Rabbi Akiva in his wisdom was able to avert. כן נגד אנשי רשע בעלי בחירה במעשיהם, העצה היא לבל להילחם נגדם, לבלתי יתמרמרו בחוזקה כנגדו, כי אם יסבול וייסע עד שיעבור זעמם. So he says that the analogy here is that the waves are the wicked. If the wicked are high, like these waves, the wicked are having their moment and they're setting upon somebody. So rather than trying to fight them, a person should just let them have their moment, or should recognize that the wicked are are at an advantage, and then he should wait it out until their moment passes so that he can survive in the long term. So it's like a strategic play in the sense of even though you're letting the waves or the wicked win right now, you're understanding that just as the wave is very strong now, eventually it will crash back down, and then you will have the opportunity to survive and to defeat it. So that's the Eitz Yosef's understanding of this teaching of the Chachamim. The Marsha, which I don't have here, but the Marsha actually, I should have brought it on the source sheet, I apologize. But the Marsha, in his comments at the beginning of Bava Batra, in the Perek with all of the Agadata, so let me take a step back, right? There's a particular Perek in Bava Batra which is famous for being the most Agadic heavy Perek in Shas. In particular, all the stories of Rabba Bar Chana, where he tells a lot of very hyperbolic Agadatot about all these crazy things that happened to him that he saw, and he tells like 20-something stories that are, the question is, how are you supposed to understand them? Because they describe these things that are beyond what we would understand to be physically possible. So Rabbi Bar Bachan has a whole series of stories in Bava Batra where he describes these very fantastical and folkloric type things that happened to him. And so the first one of those stories, which is what kicks off these series of Agadatot in Bava Batra, it says as follows: Amar Rabba, another gear says Rabba Bar Bachana. So Ishtauli Nachute Yama. So Nachute Yama is those who go out to sea. So the seafarers told me as follows. The sailors told me as follows: Hai Gala Dim Tabalis Fina. So waves which are strong enough to sink a boat. Mitchaze Ki Tzutzita Denura Chiyurta Beresha. That if you see those waves at a particular time, the waves that can threaten to sink a boat, right when they're at their, before they're about to crash, so you can see at the peak or at the crest of those waves, this flame of white fire, this kind of spark of white fire that is at the top of these waves. Umachinan le be'aliyota dechakik ale ehyeh asher ehyeh. Ya Hashem Tzvaot, Amen Amen Sela, V'naich. But if at that exact moment when you see this particular white flame coming out from the top of the wave, you hit the wave with a stick, which is engraved upon the stick the following phrase: Ya Hashem Tzvaot, Amen Amen Sela. That will V'naich. That will cause the wave to subside and will spare whatever ship was being threatened by it. So again, without going into too much about what this Agadata is trying to say, this is the first Agadata in these series of Agadata which get much more fantastical than this. But here we have an example of this big wave that has this white crest at the top of it. So the Maharsha, in his comments on this Gemara, tries to draw a parallel or a relationship between this particular idea and what we saw in Yevamot. Because he says as follows. He says, first of all, he goes and explains what is this white flame on the top, or this white crest at the top of these waves. So each wave, according to the Maharsha, represents a nation of the world. And Rabba Bar Chana is basically teaching that these nations that are threatening to destroy or flood the boat, so each of them has an angel that is appointed over the nation. Right? Because we know in Midrash, in a lot of Midrashim, that each nation, like there's Sar Shel Esav, for example, each nation has an angel appointed over it. So you have these waves, and then the white crest at the top represents the angel. But you have these big nations that are coming, right? And so the particular Agadata here is about how, in the Maharsha's eyes, that if you strike these waves as they're rearing their heads with a stick that says one of these phrases, then you can defeat the wave. So the first example is because the first nation that really threatened Bnei Israel, of course, was Mitzrayim, where we just celebrated Pesach. And so the name is the name that God tells Moshe, is the name that you should Kol Tomru Bnei Israel. That's the name of God that is sent to defeat Egypt. So if you strike the first wave, which is the wave of, or the angel and wave of Mitzrayim, with the so you can defeat them. Then you have Yash and Sargot. So the Maharsha explains each of these names of God appears in different prophecies, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, in reference to different nations. and then Amen Amen Selah deals with the Achrei Yamim. But the idea being that you can defeat these waves or these nations with the stick. So they're striking it with a stick with God's name. So what the Maharsha says is, if we understand that these waves, these massive waves, are a metaphor or an allegory for the nations of the world, then perhaps if we go back to what Rabbi Akiva is saying here, when he says, "How did you survive?" So he says, there was a board that I clung onto, and then each wave that came, I lowered my head. So Rabbi Akiva, what does that mean that he lowered his head? So if each wave that came to threaten and to drown Rabbi Akiva, so instead of trying to fight them, he let them pass. And so what the Maharsha says is that perhaps we can understand this in the sense of, right, if you have sand on the shore, so you have these massive waves, but by the time they come to the shore, for the most part, they've died down, right? They crash, but then they come up onto the sand, and then they lose all of their strength. And so the sand, as it were, like lowers its head, and these waves come and crash into them, but then the waves go back into the sea, and the sand stays exactly where it always was. So Bnei Yisrael are compared to chol, right? To the chol, and they're as numerous as the sand. So what the Maharsha tries to argue is that perhaps Rabbi Akiva here, aside from perhaps telling a factual story about how he survived the shipwreck, is making a larger allegorical point, where he says, how do I survive being cast out at sea? Is that when these nations are coming and threatening to overwhelm, so then we should lower our head. We should let them. And this is what the Chachamim are saying. Yevואו רשעים על אדם ינענע ראשו. In other words, they're understanding that allegorical way of what the Galim represent here. That if the wicked are coming and it's their time, so instead of trying to fight them, you should just lower your head and recognize that they're just as they are now high, so too one day they will fall. And if you lower your head and let the waves pass over you, or let the nations kind of go over you, and just yizbol, as the Eitz Yosef said, then you'll outlive them and you'll outlast them, and they'll die down and go back into the sea.
Tragically, in Rabbi Akiva's later biography, he didn't follow his own advice.
With Bar Kochva?
Yeah, he perished, by trying to defeat an enemy that was too strong.
Right. I guess, right. How do you reconcile this with his actions with Bar Kochva and trying to support Bar Kochva? Yeah. I mean, I think this is an interesting concept just in general in terms of how, there's an idea of, are Jews supposed to be just these kind of subservient, victimized people, or are we supposed to be people who fight and take action? And kind of that was the big thing with Tzionut the last 70 years, where kind of the Holocaust versus the founding of the State of Israel, right? That the Tzionut is all about how the Jews are supposed to fight and not just go like sheep to the slaughter, and that in a lot of ways, perhaps the last 2,000 years of Galut is all about demonizing the nations and saying, like we're just Jews and we stay in our own bubble and just kind of, playing the victim within ourselves versus us kind of really fighting, which is a larger topic. But I mean, that seems to be the advice that we're learning out from here, which is that it's best, at least when you see that a nation is on the rise, or whatever im yevואו רשעים על אדם means, that, it's best to just, when you see that they have the advantage or the upper hand, to just, instead of, I guess, what Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochva did, which is to fight anyways and end up being martyred like at Masada or something, to just let them have their moment and kind of play the long game and recognize that you can eventually outlive them, which maybe was more Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's approach, right? That he snuck out, Galata and Gittin, that he got snuck out, and then he said, "Give me Yavne," and then that was what enabled the continuation of the oral Torah and rabbinic Judaism, was that they were able to establish that even after the Romans had come and kind of wiped everybody out. So, there's kind of a political and national aspect perhaps to this teaching as well. But I think also just an ethical one on a personal level, of just in general how a person should conduct themselves, that you should be smart and know when to pick your battles and when to fight your battles, and when it's just best to kind of, recognize that something is temporary, and then eventually it's best to let it suffer through it or whatever it is, but then, in the longer run you'll come out on top. So I think that's one way that how the Maharsha tries to understand this particular Gemara. I just wanted to also look at the Iyun Yaakov, who analyzes this particular Gemara from a more halachically, because the context of all this is the halachic discussion. And he says as follows. He says, Amarti be'ota she'a, kama gdolin divrei chachamim shomrim mayim sheyesh lehem sof muteret. So he's commenting on Rabbi Gamliel's exclamation at the end, after he learns how Rabbi Akiva survived. How great were the words of the chachamim that they said that if water has no end, that you have to keep the wife and aguna, because the husband can survive. So the Iyun Yaakov says, Lichor yesh ledakdek, lama lo amar miyad shir'a oto chai kama gdolim divrei chachamim. So the Iyun Yaakov says, let's be very, very precise here, right? Why does Rabban Gamliel have to ask him how he survived and hear how he survived in order to recognize that the words of the Chachamim were correct? Just when he saw that he had survived, he should have right away declared how great are the words of the Chachamim. So the Iyun Yaakov says, okay, maybe he was curious to know how he survived, but there's a deliberate. It's deliberate that he waits with his exclamation until after he learns how Rabbi Akiva survived. What is the idea behind that? And he says, V'tu, and furthermore, so what that means is the Iyun Yaakov also asks, why, when Rabbi Gamliel says, how great are the Chachamim, when they said waters that have an end, a visible end, the woman is permitted because you assume the husband died, but waters that don't have a visible end, you assume the woman is forbidden. So the Iyun Yaakov says, why does Rabbi Gamliel have to quote both parts? The only thing that you learn from Rabbi Akiva's story is the second part, because Rabbi Akiva was out with Mayim she'en lehem sof, right? They were out at sea, and he survived, which teaches you that you should make sure the wife is asura. So why does he quote also the idea that Mayim sheyesh lehem sof muteret? Again, the Iyun Yaakov is being very, very precise here, because on a simple reading, you could just say because that was the whole teaching. In other words, the Chachamim, they said, this is the halacha here, and this is the halacha here, so he quotes the whole teaching. But the Iyun Yaakov says the only part of this teaching that Rabbi Gamliel learned from Rabbi Akiva was the second half, so why does he also say the first half? So the Iyun Yaakov says as follows. V'nireli, d'mitchila ala al da'ato she'al pi nes nitzol. Perhaps Rabbi Gamliel thought that Rabbi Akiva would survive via a miracle. V'im ken lo haya yachol lomar kama gdolim divrei chachamim. D'yesh lomar de'en maskirin ma'aseh nisim kedita b'divrei Rabbi Meir shem ayin bet b'shas ve'od de'i ma'aseh nisim raya. Actually, I'll go back to that. So he says, first of all, Rabbi Gamliel thought, okay, maybe Rabbi Akiva could survive via a miracle. But then if he does survive via a miracle, then he can't say how great are the words of the Chachamim that they said as follows, right? Why not? Because let me ask you this: why not? If Rabbi Gamliel thought that Rabbi Akiva survived via a miracle, why then would he not be able to conclude that Rabbi Akiva's survival is a support for this teaching? Because the premise of this whole teaching is that a person can survive. A person can survive out when there's no visible end at sight, but a person will not survive if there is a visible end at sight and you didn't hear about it. So if you're already dealing with the world of miracles, and this is what the Iyun Yaakov says, right? Right? If you say a person can survive via a miracle, so then you have to be concerned even when it is a visible end to the water. Right? Because even if it's a place where you can see the whole thing and you don't hear about it, perhaps they survived via a miracle. Perhaps a miracle came and took him and put him on the other side of the world. Who knows? You should always have to have a chashash that the husband can survive if you're accounting for miracles. Right? But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to all the halachot of aguna, we don't account for miracles. Right? You work within the world of teva, of mitziut, of what naturally occurs. And so you don't say, but a miracle could be at play here. And so that's why that's perhaps why Rabbi Gamliel initially was uncomfortable if he thought that Rabbi Akiva survived from a miracle to conclude that it's a support for the Chachamim. Ma she'en ken achar shamar lo gal v'gal v'chulei. But once he asked Rabbi Akiva, how did you survive? And Rabbi Akiva told him the story of the waves. Im ken en ze derech nes rak derech hateva. Rabbi Akiva survived through his own wit and through naturalistic means, not through a miracle. V'chein katvu atosvot lehedya b'dibur matcha in maskirin, etc. Im ken, in that case, Shapir amar kama gdolim divrei chachamim demayim sheish lem sof ishto muteret. Ki ein chosheshin lema'aseh nisim, ve'en lem sof ishto asura sheyachol linetzel b'derech hateva. So he says, now I can understand and answer my two questions. He says, first of all, why did Rabbi Gamliel ask him how he survived and only declare Kama Gdolim Divrei Chachamim after Rabbi Akiva told him that he survived through natural means? Because Rabbi Gamliel wanted to add a possibility in his head that Rabbi Akiva survived via a miracle, and if he survived via a miracle, it wouldn't be a support for the words of the Chachamim, because then you would have to even say Mayim Sheish Lem Suf Asura. So only once Rabbi Akiva told him how he survived, that it wasn't a miracle, that he said, okay, so then this is then a support for what the Chachamim said, where they draw a distinction between these two cases. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, why do I then have to teach both of these instead of just the second one? So the Yaakov says at the end, Ma'im sheyesh lehem sof muteret, deha kavanato, Ma'im ein chosheshin lema'aseh nisim, right? Because we don't take miracles into account when we're deciding halacha. So that's why we have to say both of them, right? Because it could be that Rabbi Akiva taught me this, Ma'im she'en lehem sof asura, because he survived. But if a person survives via a miracle, then I would have to say even Ma'im she'esh lehem sof muteret. So from the fact that Rabbi Gamliel is teaching both of them, he's emphasizing that we don't look at miracles, and this is not a case of a miracle, and therefore the Chachamim are correct across the board, where A, a person can survive in waters that are not visible, and we wouldn't have heard about it necessarily, and B, that if they are visible, then you do allow the wife to go marry, and you aren't afraid that maybe the person survives via a miracle and you just didn't hear about it. So that's how the Yaakov is very, very medayek in the wording of this particular teaching of Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva. That's it. Shkoyach. So, yeah. Shkoyach. So, Hadron Alach, Maseches Yevamot, the Agadata parts.
Also.
And yeah, next week we'll start Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah starts off with Agadata. It's the only Masechet in Shas, I believe, that starts with Agadata. In other words, there's a Mishnah, and then right away it goes into a ton of Agadata. So it'll kind of be learning the beginning of the Masechet as well.